General Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, noted that if in 10 years, this is, by the way, in 1951, if in 10 years all American troops stationed in Europe for national defense purposes have not been returned to the United States, then this whole project will have failed. Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, said the United States must lead, but it must not carry. President Kennedy said, we want to make sure that NATO is not a fair weather organization. The burden of freedom must be shared equally among its members. LBJ stated, LBJ had similar thoughts, and his administration demanded offset agreements from West Germany to cover the costs of U.S. troops there. President Nixon and Henry Kissinger. Nixon noted, the United States will participate in the defense and development of allies and friends, but America cannot and will not conceive all plans, design all programs, execute all decisions, and undertake all the defense of free nations of the world. Caspar Weinberger said, our European allies must recognize that security cannot be achieved by words alone. It must be backed by commitment and capability. Robert Gates, in his farewell speech to NATO, said there will be a dwindling appetite to expand increasingly precious funds on behalf of nations that are apparently unwilling to devote the necessary resources to be serious and capable partners in their own defense. Even Secretary Mattis said Americans cannot care more for your children's future security than you do. While some of my colleagues have been wringing their hands over the possibility that the United States might step away from its role as the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, I can tell you who isn't all that worried about it. It's the American people. Quite frankly, they probably thought that ended when Dwight D. Eisenhower was no longer the Supreme Allied Commander. And speaking of General Eisenhower, I read that quote. If in 10 years all American troops in Europe for military purposes have not returned to the United States, then this whole project will have failed. That's 70 years ago, over 70 years ago. Time and time again, the United States is expected to shoulder Europe's defense while rich European countries sit back, issue statements, and undeliver. Some of my colleagues point out that since the war in Ukraine began, Europe has collectively spent as much as on European defense as the United States, as if that's some great triumph. To me, it just shows how upside down this whole arrangement is. How is it even remotely impressive that the nations defending their own continent are only barely keeping pace with the country across the Atlantic? If Europe really believes it's facing an existential threat from Russia, it should be spending not just as much as we have, but magnitudes more than we do. 10 times, 100 times. That's what a commitment would look like. And please stop telling me that comparing spending in Europe is even. That's laughably narrow. When you compare U.S. defense spending in Europe to Europe's, you ignore everything else America does worldwide, much of which directly benefits Europe. Who ensures freedom of navigation in the Red Sea when European trade flows there daily? We do. Who contains China's growing dominance across the Indo-Pacific, stabilizing global markets and maritime routes that Europe depends on? We do. Without U.S. global power projection, the European way of life wouldn't exist as we know it. And still, they won't even take primary responsibility for their own backyard. If Russia really is a continent-wide threat, as European leaders say, then where is the urgency? Where is the mobilization? With few exceptions, Poland and the Baltic states, Europe is not acting like it's facing down a generational threat, not even close. And I'm getting tired of being asked to go home to Missouri and explain to working Americans, the people I represent, why they should send more money, more troops, more of their sons and daughters to defend a continent that refuses to defend itself. Why should we care more about Moscow than people in Paris who are 2 hours away by plane? It doesn't make sense, and it's time to stop pretending that it does. For 80 years, we've told Europe to get serious about their own defense. They have blown us off. They haven't listened. Maybe they never will, as long as we keep doing the job for them. So yes, maybe we should have a conversation about the Supreme Allied Commander role. Maybe having an American general in that seat furthers this ruse. We should have the debate, not simply dismiss it. Let's have an honest conversation about it. American priorities in Europe, what they should be. Let's stop confusing symbolism with strategy. And while we're at it, maybe let's stop waving foreign flags on the House floor when Americans can barely afford groceries. Some of my colleagues seem to think that defending Ukraine matters more than defending our own border. I disagree, and so do the American people. It's time to have a serious realignment. Let Europe grow up and carry its own weight. America's job is not to babysit the world. It's to protect our people and our interests. Full stop. General Cavoli, I had a bunch of questions for you, but I had to say what I had to say. So I guess since I'm the chairman, I'll ask one question right now. Greenland. Greenland. Can you just talk about the strategic importance and why that matters to the United States of America?
Sure. I'll talk about it from my perspective as...
Yeah, not from a policy perspective, from a military perspective.
But from a military perspective, Senator, I'll limit my comments to my field of expertise, which is the European theater, right? EUCOM AOR and the SACEUR AOR. The key there is it forms the western border of the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, which is that body of water through which Russian submarines from the Northern Fleet in Murmansk come up and then down through that gap. And once they get past that gap, they break out into the Atlantic. It becomes very tough to track them. It's a vast expanse. There are some acoustic things about the underwater geography that make it pretty tough. From those positions that they can achieve, they can hold the U.S. homeland at risk, several important targets with land attack cruise missiles. Greenland is the western boundary of that gap. So my access to it, the airspace and water space bounding Greenland, is absolutely critical for the United States.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Senator Schmitt. First of all, thank you both for your service, and I join many of my colleagues in regretting your retirement. You both have been frank, informative, dedicated, and really models of public service, and I wish you well on behalf of all of it. General Cavoli, we've talked over the years about Vladimir Putin's murderous invasion of Ukraine. There's no question who the aggressor is here, and there's no question in my mind that the aggression, this murderous, bloody assault, is continuing with undiminished force against Ukraine. As you note very powerfully in your testimony, Russia is building its military strength. The Kremlin learns quickly and historically that it restructures forces as necessary. It's already reconstituting itself. It's tapping additional manpower and preparing to continue this assault, and at the same time slow walking and playing us in supposed negotiations. I'm not going to ask you to comment on the negotiations. I recognize that your mission is military in nature, but I would ask you how you would characterize Russia's ability to recoup its material and personnel losses in Ukraine. Will it succeed in rebuilding after its losses, and what kind of threat does that represent to American security interests?
Sure, Senator. Thank you. So if we divide Russia's rebuilding capability into two big blocks, personnel and equipment, I believe the personnel they'll be able to build as quickly as they want to. They continue to maintain a conscription. You saw that just last week, the Russian government announced its annual conscription drive. It increased by 10,000 over last year, 160,000 this year. With those numbers, they will be able to constitute the force size that they choose fairly quickly. Be a little tougher, take them a little bit more time to organize it into the sort of organizations that they have said they want to build after the war. They want to have an army of about 1.5 million, they've announced. They want to put a lot of it on the border of NATO and northeastern Europe. It'll take them a little bit of time to do that, but we're talking a couple of years. Equipment, that depends on how much more they lose inside Ukraine, sir. They've lost a vast amount of equipment inside Ukraine. They started the war with someplace near 13,000 tanks on active and in storage, and they're starting to approach near the end of that, near the end of the useful tanks and storage. So depending on how much more they lose, that will really determine how quickly they can regenerate. They have expanded their capability to produce some things, artillery shells, cruise missiles, tremendously. And they're producing some things, such as one-way attack drones, in prodigious numbers that they weren't even producing at all before the war.
And I would characterize that capability as offensive. In other words, they're not defending against a possible invasion from Ukraine. They are preparing for continuing offensive actions against Ukraine and possibly NATO allies if they are successful in Ukraine.
And I would add to that, Senator, that this is not just in the ground domain. They have long-range aviation that practices daily, moving out and doing strikes across North America. They have their strategic ballistic missile fleet, their road mobiles that are constantly out there, and they have their submarine fleet that's constantly out there. So it's not just in those domains. And then there is, of course, the cyber domain, in which they're very active. We can talk about in closed session, sir.
Just one last question, General, because I've heard from some of the critics of our military aid to Ukraine that there are significant numbers of weapons embezzled, stolen, missing from the aid that we're providing Ukraine. On every one of the visits, I've been to Ukraine 6 times now, I've talked to our military and logistics folks in Poland, and they are tracking virtually every bullet that we have provided to Ukraine, and there's no evidence whatsoever of this kind of misconduct or misappropriation of our aid to Ukraine. Would you agree?
Yeah, I do agree with that, Senator. There will be a challenge locating all of it later. All of us have been in combat, realize that it's pretty easy to misplace things and to lose track of things. But we've seen no deliberate effort to transfer, sell, or steal weaponry. The Ukrainians are using it to defend their country.
My hope is that Russia will take seriously the efforts to peace and stop stonewalling and slow walking negotiations, but right now they seem to be playing us and playing for time. And I want to thank you again for your incredible service, both of you, to our great country. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.